to the third module of Sociocultural Factors in Literacy. I'm here to kind of go over some of the major learning theories that really help to shape what we mean by culturally responsive pedagogy. So we're going to develop that framework by looking at some of the learning theories, some of which you're going to be very familiar with, and kind of applying them to this context. We're going to begin to explore classroom and curriculum strategies. What does it look like to be a culturally relevant classroom? And then I'm going to introduce the final project for the course for you in here, okay? So let me just begin by saying I myself am a big constructivist. And many of you probably would say, if you were asked, about a learning theory that you aligned with, I think language arts people really do tend to believe in constructivism, which is, it comes out of the work of John Dewey, and it's this idea that we construct our own learning by interacting with the world around us. At its core, really what we're looking at is that our learning happens because of the content that we're given, the context that we're given that information in, and the activities that we're asked to do as a result of learning this information. So we really need to understand the goals of the learner if we're going to use a constructivist, and we have to attend to helping the learner see what we're doing as goal-oriented. And we really want to if we believe in this constructivist theory, we really believe that learning is a personal process, and that we make meaning very individually and there's not a one-size-fits-all attitude about learning in a constructivist classroom, and that really it's about helping the students kind of test the degree to which their constructs or their understandings, kind of how they're compatible with the information that we give in our classrooms. So really, and in a nutshell, what constructivists believe is we know something, right? We know something about the world around us. And so we have this construct, so in this cartoon, Bart has this idea that, don't worry, it's cool, Homer's on the job, man. And so he's got this construct, this belief about his dad, everything's going to be okay. But that is going to be tested when he looks at the context and the new information that he's getting when he sees how Homer's kind of blowing it, right? So constructivism is grounded in John Dewey's work. And Dewey, we know, is a really, really important work, really important theorist. How we think is really probably one of the most important educational theories, works that came out of the 20th century. And he really believes that we learn, that we're born with this natural and innate desire to learn. And so instruction and tradition and experience all kind of work together. And, we are social beings. And so we have information that we bring into the classroom. We have information that is shared in the classroom, and we have expectations that are brought to us because we're in the classroom. And they all contribute to kind of picking up our thoughts and beliefs, even when we're unaware. So we might not believe that, say, we walk into a classroom and we sort of change our demeanor a little bit because of tradition, because we have this innate understanding of how you're supposed to act in a classroom, something like that. Dewey is arguing that new learning has to come into contact with what we already know. So that's why this idea of background knowledge is important. So what I'm going to do as a teacher is I'm going to give you some new information, but I'm going to kind of bring that new information in relationship to what you already knew when you came in. And it's in that interaction and the experiences that the teacher sets up for what I know to interact with what I'm learning. It's in there that we come to new understandings. So it's really important that a teacher understand in a constructivist classroom that our learners come in independent with their own experiences, their own knowledge, that we need to not just give information, we also have to have them do something with that information, because it's in that doing something with the new information that they start to figure out, okay, how does what she say or he says as the teacher relate to what I already know about the world around me? So shortly after Dewey, we have Piaget who enters in, and these are really they're complementary ideas. Really, Piaget is kind of looking at what is the nature of the learning and the understandings that our students are bringing into the classroom. And so Piaget really saw learning as a passing of stages, and that teachers need to be aware of what stage their students is in, and then stimulate students within those within that learning developmental age. Okay. Piaget says that to understand is to discover or reconstruct by rediscovery. So he really was essentially a constructivist himself. So new learning happens under Piaget's theories when a learner's experience cannot be sort of explained in the information, the knowledge that the student has before the new content is shared with them. So if I come in and I know something, say about the sky, and I'm a young, I'm a child, and I come in and I know something about clouds. I know that clouds have shapes, and that clouds are white, and that clouds come out in summer days. And then I come into an early science class where maybe they're talking a little bit about condensation and the role clouds have in the different types of clouds that exist out there. Suddenly, what I know about clouds is going to come in contact with what the teacher is sharing with me, the new information she's sharing with me. And the teacher has to make sure that they're sharing it in a way that is developmentally appropriate for the learner. So he looks at these stages, the sensor motor stage, where everything is in response to sensory curiosity about the world. The pre-operational, which is symbolic thinking or use of proper syntax and grammar to express full concepts. Imagination is beginning, but complex and abstract thought will be very difficult. So we're not going to talk about something like a black hole in a science class with a 3-year-old, but we would talk about something about like a cloud, because a cloud is something that's in there every day. Around 7 years old, students move into concrete operational, and this is where concepts are attached to concrete situations. So this is the idea that, something like very firm. This idea that you have always exists within this context that you shared with me. So time, space, and quantity are understood and can be applied, but they're not really independent concepts. They kind of like see, so if you do an experiment, they aren't always understand, like a science experiment. They're not always understanding that it worked in that context, maybe because of the temperature or maybe because of the amount, and they'd expect that same reaction to always happen. When they get into 11th grade, they get into the formal operations, which is more where they're able to do the abstract, the higher thinking, the reasoning. And so, it's really important that that teachers who believe in Piaget's understanding, that teachers kind of take into account where the student is developmentally. You're probably going to recognize this from earlier. So Piaget and John Dewey, they were learning theorists that kind of looked at how we gain new information, but they didn't really look at so much about how our membership in a group or community, how that kind of influences us and how that shapes our learning, and what role it might play in that constructing of new knowledge or schema. So the person that really introduces this idea that our membership in groups and our social membership sort of plays a role, that was really the Russian linguist Lev Vygotsky. And it's probably not a surprise that it comes from a Russian linguist, because if you think about it, communism and the communal nature of society, that was really, really in the forefront of Lev Vygotsky's work. And so what he does is he takes this idea of constructivism, which Piaget and Dewey are looking at, we are individuals, we come in with our individual knowledge, but what Lev Vygotsky adds in is that some of the knowledge that we have is a result of cultural understandings that are shared with us from, throughout society. So maybe it's cultural expectations, cultural norms, maybe it's maybe it's stories and content, under like concrete ideas that are shared. So you think about something like, you grow up in a religion, in a cultural context of a religion. Well, suddenly an understanding that you have is that there is a higher being. That's not an understanding that's a universal understanding. That's an understanding that a child who comes from a religious faith community, that child would bring. A child who comes from a different type of community would bring a different set of understandings. So Vygotsky really did acknowledge that Piaget was correct, that there are cognitive stages for children, but he expanded it to this idea that there's a component of proximal development. So, yes, students are working within their sort of developmental stages, but it is possible to move a child who's in, say, the pre-operational into a concrete operational, or a child that's concrete operational into the formal operations by what he called the zone of proximal development. So if you have one child who's more advanced in their thinking, or you as the more knowledgeable other as the teacher, if you're in the formal operations stage of development, you can help your student to come to a more complex understanding than they're developmentally at on their own by interacting with them. This is what he called the zone of proximal development. Many of you may have heard that in your undergrad, but what he's arguing, though, is that, while Piaget is correct, we have our developmental phases, we also aren't kind of like tied to them. We can move fluidly from one developmental stage to the other. And one of the ways that we move from that stage is by having interactions with more knowledgeable others. So Vygotsky's theory then becomes the basis for what we know as social constructivism, which is this idea that groups to which a learner belongs impact the learning because we are not individuals, we are groups, and our individual identity is in fact kind of developed through our shared identity as well as, our individual experiences. So I want to take a minute and just kind of say at this point, these are really learning theories. They're really not teaching theories. So what are the implications on teaching? So we have to think about this is if we believe in constructivism or social constructivism, we have to start to think about what becomes the role of the teacher. Suddenly the teacher in this context is really somebody who needs to pose problems that are relevant to the student, and so that the student takes them in, kind of starts to bring this new learning into relationship with their own schema. Really, in a constructivist, we have to structure the learning. We need to value the student's point of view, and we need to adapt a curriculum that addresses what a student brings in, what their suppositions are, what they're learning that they're bringing into, what they may have already learned before they come into the classroom, and how that might affect the way that they attain and retain the information that you present. So in a constructivist classroom, it's the job of the teacher to create enabling context for students. Enabling context means that, we really need to worry about how we're setting up and constructing our lesson. It's not just about the content, but it's about, are we bringing that content to our learners in a way that allows them to kind of like bring it to their own thinking. Okay, so we need to think about this in terms of language and how, so ever since we were children, we were told that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Names will never hurt me. But we know that that's not true. I mean, we know that inherently because we know that it does matter when we're called names. It does matter when students say something to us that's hurtful. So as a high school English teacher, I greatly appreciated that my students were able to make meaning of a text in a way that kind of intersected their own experiences with what the text was that we were reading. So I had to learn to really appreciate that it wasn't about Shakespeare alone. It was about my student and my student's experiences and Shakespeare. So when we're talking about Hamlet, it's about talking about, let's talk about step families and the difficulty of divorce and how hard it often is to acknowledge and accept a new stepfather or something like that. because that's what my students brought to it. And then Shakespeare brought in his story about Hamlet the prince who wants to avenge his father's death because his uncle, who's married to his mother now, he believes has murdered his father. So like this, these become really, really important, that it's not just about the text and it's not just about the student, but it's about how those two things can intersect. So what we want to think about then is we want to think about that to get our students to comprehend, we need to relate new experiences to what they already know. And learning is changing or elaborating on what is already known. So language then becomes important because it's the vehicle by which we can share. I cannot share my thinking with you. My thinking is personal. My thinking is my own. But I can share my language with you, right? And so it's important for us to remember that language really plays a role in facilitating our ability to learn, to be able to expand our background and to widen our constructs. It's equally important to remember that different groups have different linguistic practices that are neither better nor worse, but are just different. So when I'm coming to a situation where, I want to bring us all to a shared understanding, but I have students that maybe are coming from, social contexts where maybe they're speaking Black vernacular English, or they have a dialect, or a set of slang that they use. Well, that's something that I need to take into account, and I need to figure out how to use the language to bring us to a shared construction of knowledge. Okay? All right. So, in a constructivist classroom, then, language instruction would be geared towards big idea learning rather than sort of isolated skills. We don't want to worry so much about grammar in and of itself. It's about learning the grammar so that we can share our writing in a way that is kind of more universally understood. In their book, Search for Learning, The Case for Constructivist Classrooms, Jacqueline and Martin Brooks suggest that some underlying principles exist for constructivist teaching. These include presenting information holistically, with students engaging in content in a multitude of ways. It also means that you challenge current concepts, that you kind of bring their ideas, you kind of challenge their ideas, or you let them challenge the ideas that you're bringing to the classroom. And constructive language classrooms involve teaching and engaging with students in strategies that are designed to help them connect their prior learning to the information presented in the text. So in a constructive classroom, it would not be appropriate to simply disallow the students from using their own language or cultural practices. It's how to get them to use those languages and cultural practices in a way that then helps them to bring it to the formal learning or the academic learning. I hope that makes sense. All right. So it is evident and clear to see how culturally responsive practices come out of the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. They really are a natural extension of the theories that emerged about good teaching. And so what we have here is, these are the principles for building a learning community that come out of the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. And look at what they have. You affirm your students' cultural connections. You invite them into the classroom. You you take into account physical differences in culture so that you are culturally inviting for your students. It means that you allow your Muslim students to, wear the appropriate headgear if they're older girls, things like that. Students are reinforced for their academic development, meaning that you constantly you believe all learners can learn, and you're constantly reinforcing the academic nature in a way that doesn't make them choose between their academic and their social and cultural selves. Instructional changes are made to accommodate differences. Classroom is managed with firm, consistent, and loving control. I like that term, loving control. Interaction stress collectivity as well as individuality. So you can see how we have both Vygotsky and Piaget and Dewey kind of influencing this. And so what we have here, and she has it as a circle, like all of these things need to happen, and they need to be happening simultaneously, and they need to be going recursively back and forth in that. So what are some of the strategies that we need to think about in terms of how can we become more culturally sensitive? First one is to be reflective. And I know that's like trite, but it's actually really kind of sometimes hard for us to understand how our own sort of cultural practices, where we don't understand that that's something that we do because that's our cultural practices, that it's not necessarily universal. We want to incorporate diversity into the classroom, meaning that we want to be able to get readings and representations of a whole different, a whole rainbow of peoples and lands and ideas. And we want to establish ground rules in the classroom. It's really, really important. This goes really well with PBIS and all the discussion in schools about positive behavior interventions and supports, and I think that's that's not a coincidence as we're moving into a complex, more complex social world. We want to use teaching strategies that accommodate the needs of diverse learners. We want to present information in many ways. We want to be flexible, and we always want to be open to student feedback. And so those are some things that we want to take into account. Okay, and so let's look real quick at this very short video. Using Powtoon. Oh, I meant to cut that off. All right. So, thinking about what that's talking about, and really the student-centered nature of a classroom, I thought it might be interesting for us to, if you go into, all right, our first week, and I'm doing this without you having been, so let me get logged into like garylec.edu. I'm going to get into Leo. Our first week, I asked you to write in, and you put them into, I'm sorry, I've got to get all the way over to our course. See, I'm writing this before the summer. Okay, so let's get into the course. So I asked you over the first course of the information, I asked you to post in the forum a Where I'm From poem, right? And I used my Where I'm From. And this would be a simple way for you to be able to kind of get a sense of the diverse experiences of your students. I was fairly sort of generic mentor family in a way, but I also had six kids in my family, which was unique and different. And I had 3 older brothers, which was something that sort of set me apart. And I had, a father whose parents were a grandfather who was a first-generation Lithuanian and a father who was Irish, and so these were some unique things about me that, even though it seemed vanilla, I was like everybody else, I really wasn't. And so what would be kind of cool is if, to be culturally relevant, you allowed students to kind of explore themselves. And so what I have created is you're going to go to this book track classroom, and you can create your own login. This is a great, I hope that you can, that you'll use this, but what you're going to do is you're going to add a class. I shouldn't have logged in as myself, I guess. But when it says add a class, join a class, you'll get join a class. What you're going to do is you're going to put in the class code, which is on here, CGNAGN. And then what I want you to do is I want you to create a book track. And so when you create a book track, and this one is one that I did a while ago, when you create a book track, you're going to be able to create pictures. I picked this picture because of my line in my book track about the willow tree. And then you can create songs, and you get a chance. Some of you will see, you'll get the ability in your book track. Some of you will make it multiple pages, things like that. But what something like this would allow, very simple, it gives the learner some opportunity to kind of express themselves and express who they are. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to kind of like put our sort of self into learner mode and think about how this would be different if we were learners. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to watch a video that is linked on Leo about the Hawaiian culture based education strategies. Hawaii is really in the forefront of culturally relevant pedagogy because of its strong Native population and the strong Native influence that population has had on the state. Then you're going to read a chapter from this really simple book. I loved it. It's from ASCD, very quick read, called Create Success. And I linked this on Leo. Then what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and I want you to imagine you're a student. Complete a book track for your Where I'm From poem. Publish it for the class to see. And then what I want you to do is I want you to combine all these different experiences and write a 2-page reflection that addresses what does all this mean to my teaching? What does it mean to me for my teaching if I think about all of these different ways that I was, that it was demonstrated that I could be culturally responsive in my teaching. And then what I want you to do is I want you to read the overview of the end of the course project and make sure that you email any questions about this because the end of the course will come quick and I want to make sure that you know that the courses are, that you know what's going to be expected of you. And so I want you to see here, I have lined up here, I have some sources for you if you wanted to get more information about constructivism, you want to do some additional reading, here it is for you, okay? Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.